Good evening, everyone. Chodesh Tov. There have been in Jewish history a number of waves of immigration, Jews moving from one country to another. The Jews originally went from Babylonia to North Africa, and then from North Africa they went to Spain. They were in Spain a long time, 800 years. They were fairly numerous, they were quite influential and wealthy, and then they were expelled from Spain. When they were expelled from Spain, they went all over the world, basically in the Mediterranean basin, but really even to Eastern Europe. The Jews who lived in France were expelled. They moved to Germany. The Jews in Germany suffered in the Middle Ages terrible persecutions. So they continued to move eastward into Eastern Europe. And that was the situation pretty much until the 18th century. A new continent was discovered, the American continent. And the original settlers who came to what later would be the United States and Canada were originally Dutch, French, and then eventually the majority were English. In colonial times, the early 1700s, there were practically no Jews in the American colonies. There were Jews who came from the West Indies, the Caribbean, and they came because of business. They were traders, they were merchants, they were engaged in the sugar trade and other things. And those Jews eventually settled on the southeastern coast of the United States. So there was a Jewish community in Charleston, South Carolina, in Savannah, Georgia, in Jacksonville, Florida, but there were no substantial Jewish communities. They were interesting people. Research has shown us that, for instance, Alexander Hamilton, the first Secretary of the Treasury of the United States, and whose picture appears on its currency, was descended from Jews in Jamaica, though he himself never was Jewish. There also were Jews who came to New York. Those were Dutch Jews who worked for the Dutch East India Company. New York, for a period of time, was governed by Holland. And Peter Stuyvesant was the governor of New York. And he was very anti-Jewish. And he attempted to ban the Jews from living in New York. Since the Dutch East India Company was heavily financed by Jewish financiers, they saw to it that he was removed from office. And even though New York City till today has Dutch origins, Harlem was a Dutch name, the Van Wyck Expressway, which is everything but, and other remembrances of Dutch presence in the country. It was the English that took over. And as the colonies developed, by the middle of the 18th century, there was a trickling of Jews who came to settle in the United States, overwhelmingly Sephardic Jews who were merchants and traders, again, connected to the West Indies and connected to the trading centers in Europe, London and Amsterdam. But there was no major Jewish substance, major Jewish community. Now these Jews established synagogues, and they established cemeteries. In the heart of New York is an old Jewish cemetery from the 1700s. Just to show you how sensitive or insensitive, it's located in a very, very desirable area. So there was a developer that proposed that he was going to build a high-rise over the cemetery, and he would raise the high-rise so that it wasn't direct, so there was space between the cemetery and between where the building began. And he was opposed by the Landmark Commission, but the Jewish community in New York thought it was a pretty good idea. It never happened. But that's one of the landmarks of Jewish presence in New York in colonial times. 1776 is the Declaration of Independence. The colonies break off from England after a long and bitter war. The United States of America comes into being. Now, the Jews who lived during the Revolutionary War, 50% of them were patriots, so to speak, on the side of the Americans. 50% of them were loyalists who were on the side of England. After the war was over, the American patriots forced all the loyalists out of the country. Many went to Canada, but most went back to England. And there was a very small Jewish community. Now, the Jews always wanted to portray themselves as patriots. So therefore, they fostered a legend about Chaim Solomon, who was a Sephardic Jew, and that he somehow bankrolled Washington's army. So there's a statue to that effect of Washington and Solomon, and the Jews always were happy with it because it proved that they were on the winning side. But again, you have a very small Jewish community, Sephardic. You have the Spanish-Portuguese congregation in New York, but there's no major Jewish presence. Since there's no major Jewish presence, there's very little anti-Semitism. And not only that, the American government was founded on the basis of freedom from religion and equality of its citizens, even though the Afro-American citizens were kept as slaves. But the goals were noble. And America was not seen by the Jews in Europe as a place to go to live. The legends about America was that it was a wild place, a lawless place. You had the indigenous people who were violent, And to a great extent, therefore, the people who emigrated to the United States were
Just move it up, that's it. It's banging on the table.
well, the people who moved to the United States were of the lower class, people that ran away, and they helped form the country. But there is, again, no Jew. Now, there was a Jewish admiral in 1812, Uriah Levy was his name. He was one of the first admirals in the United States Navy. He fought against the British in the War of 1812. His family later bought Thomas Jefferson's home in Monticello, Virginia. And there's a Jewish cemetery in the backyard of Thomas Jefferson's home, the Levy family. So the United States does not have a Jewish problem. And it remained that way until towards the end of the 1840s. Then there were revolutions in Europe. Revolutions against the monarchies, revolutions against the government. It became very unstable. And this brought about the first wave of major immigration of Jews to the United States. And these Jews were from Germany. And they were Reform. And they came and they settled mainly, the German immigrants settled mainly in Ohio near Cincinnati. In fact, in the American history, that was called the Rhineland. And the German Jews came there also. And as I mentioned, the German Jews were Reform. And they were the Reform of the 1800s, not today's Reform. And the Reform of the 1800s was out to sever all ties with Judaism, in effect to assimilate as rapidly as possible into the general population. So therefore, Cincinnati became the home of Reform Judaism in the United States. Hebrew Union College was established in Cincinnati. And there was a Reform rabbi by the name of Isaac Mayer Wise, who came to the United States. He was a radical reformer in Germany. He was such a radical reformer that his congregation drove him out. And he came to America, and he was the one that established reform in the United States. So we have here, for the first time in Jewish history, that the basic infrastructure for the exile of Jews coming to a country was completely non-traditional, anti-traditional. So he established the Union of American Hebrew Congregations, Central Conference of American Rabbis, and they adopted what they called was the Pittsburgh Platform. They had a convention in Pittsburgh, and the Pittsburgh Platform said no Hebrew, no Sabbath, no dietary laws, nothing. And it said basically no Jerusalem, no land of Israel, forget it. And this was the Jewish community at the time of the American Civil War. Now, the German Jews were very successful in two areas. They became Wall Street. Kuhn Loeb, other such companies, later Lehman Brothers, etc. These were all German Jewish financial institutions that made a fortune in the Civil War and rose to prominence and rose to great wealth and therefore also rose to influence. In the Civil War, because of the fact that there was now Jewish money, so to speak, on the table, anti-Semitism increased. The Jews in the South fought on behalf of the South. The Jews in the North fought on behalf of the Jews in the North. Now, the American Army then, a lot of the supplies, because it's a civil war, were brought from home. It wasn't, so therefore they allowed all sorts of peddlers and other people to come to visit the troops and sell them things. Many of these peddlers were these German Jews. So we had a famous order issued by General Ulysses Grant that banned specifically all Jewish peddlers from the Union lines. Lincoln canceled the order and told Grant never to do that again. Now, Grant was not an anti-Semite. When he became the president, he appointed the first Jewish cabinet minister, Oscar Strauss, and he had many Jewish friends. The Jewish bankers supported him. But the stereotype of the Jew was fixed in American society. The stereotype of the Jew was money, peddlers, who are not really loyal to anybody. And because reform was so radical against Judaism, the Christians also saw it as being radical against Christianity. Because Christianity was based, and still is, it's based on Judaism. It's based on the land of Israel. It's based on Jerusalem. It's based on a Sabbath. And here you have this so-called religious group that says all of this is nonsense. So there developed a genteel anti-Semitism in America. Now, we can read of this. There's a book by Stephen Birmingham called Our Crowd, which is the story of the German Jews, Seligman Baer and all of them, in the 1850s, 60s, 70s, and how they made their own circle in New York, and they formed what became the federations. They created the Federated Charities of the City of New York, and through the federations, through these charities, they, so to speak, controlled Jewish life. And because the money was always there, and the influence was always there, so that's what American Jewry was in the eyes of the American people. Birmingham's book is an excellent book about the times. In 1871, Tsar Alexander I was assassinated. The Tsar was a despot and the author of terrible anti-Jewish decrees. Those who assassinated him were anarchists, socialists, communists, and all of those groups had a disproportionate amount of Jews that belonged to them. There are many reasons, understandable. The persecution of the Jews was number one. Got to get rid of the Tsar, he's destroying the Jews. But also because these are all utopian groups. They all promise that we're going to have the better world. They're going to bring about the dream of the ages. And that always appeals to Jews. The more utopian you are, the better your reception will be amongst the Jews. Now, this stems from our messianic beliefs, and it stems also from the way traditionally we have always thought how the world should be. The world should be equal, fair, good. Everybody should have everything, wonderful. Now, the Tsar was assassinated. He was succeeded by Alexander II. Alexander II looked at the situation and he said, we have to reform the situation. So he took away many of the decrees against the Jews. He lightened the load on the peasants, the serfs. He attempted to drag Russia, as Churchill said, screaming and kicking into the modern era. But he died at an early age. And he was succeeded by his son, who would eventually preside over the destruction of Russia and of the Romanovs. Starting in 1870 and continuing unabated for 55 years, you have a tremendous wave of emigration of Jews from Eastern and Central Europe to the United States. Sholem Aleichem had an essay in which he said the word America was magic. The moment you said America, it was magic in the Jewish world. America was going to be the escape from everything that was wrong in Europe. And therefore you have an emigration of 2.5 million Jews to the United States in a short period of time. Now, these are different Jews. These are not Reformed Jews. They're traditional Jews. They're not very scholarly. But they spoke Yiddish, and they built synagogues, but they never built schools. I remember my neighborhood in Chicago, and I was growing up at the end of the immigrant era. So we had 42 Orthodox synagogues within one neighborhood. And I'm not talking Shtiblach or house minyanim. I'm talking about buildings with great rabbonim, with hundreds of people every Sabbath. But there was not one Jewish school. And you didn't have to be a genius to figure out what's going to happen. Now, this great wave of immigration, New York absorbed 1.5 million Jews. other major cities in the United States. So all of a sudden, it was an enormous bulk of Jews. And these Jews were obviously, the German Jews were polite, genteel, well-mannered. One could not say the same for the Jews that came from the shtetl. I remember in my father's synagogue, there was an item of furniture called the spittoon. And people went and spat in it or blew their nose in it, which was not very conducive to American culture. So the Jews were looked upon as backward, primitive. They didn't speak the language. And if they spoke the language, it was with a heavy accent. Now, all of us can relate to this because we all here in Israel are also immigrants. And we know what it feels like when you try to speak Hebrew to somebody. And even though my Hebrew is perfect, they don't seem to think so. And you had other ethnic groups that came. You had a few million that came from Italy. You had Irish. You had vast waves of immigration, because America then was an open country, and America wanted the immigration because they wanted to become a continental power, push all the way to the Pacific, drive out the indigenous people. So you needed people, you needed population. The ethnic groups always warred with each other because they were at the bottom of the ladder, the rungs of the ladder. They were fighting for the same low jobs, for the same tenement apartment. So you developed an anti-Jewish atmosphere from above and from below. Now, the reform that controlled the federations created institutions on behalf of the immigrants. There was something called HIAS, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society. And there were settlement houses. There were afternoon schools, all of which the purpose was to strip them away from their Jewish roots and to try and assimilate them as quickly and as efficiently as possible into American society. On top of it, the American public school system then was built on the principle of being the melting pot. The melting pot meant that you threw everybody in, but out of it would come a unified society. So the American public school system, which was mainly staffed by Protestant spinster teachers, and had as its goal the complete assimilation of the students into what they determined would be American society. And therefore, the Jewish children didn't stand a chance because of the fact that that was like the only ball game in town, the only thing you could do. And all sorts of pressures existed to assimilate. Now, Rabbi Twersky, my friend, had a wonderful one-line description of that time. He said the immigrant generation of Jews to America wanted to give to their children what they did not have, meaning money, education, opportunity, respect. But he said they forgot to give them what they did have. And that evaporated. So the process of integration, the process of assimilation was from the first day onwards. On top of it, we had all sorts of other problems that destroyed it. There was a 6-day work week. You didn't come in on Saturday, don't bother to come in on Monday. So for the majority of American Jews, it was impossible to be a Sabbath observer. I always tell the story about my father's synagogue that it had 2 very large services on the Shabbat morning. First one was 6 in the morning. So there were 750 men that came. They prayed. They heard the Torah reading. And then they all got on the trolley and went to work. The second service was somewhat smaller. Those were people that somehow didn't go to work or didn't go to work that early in the morning. But if you didn't go to work, then how are you going to feed your family? And that was a terrible test that most American Jews were unable to pass, unable to weather that storm. And once the Sabbath was gone, then everything else was doomed to follow. On top of it, coming to America with the Jews, as part of the Jews, were all of the Jewish anarchists, communists, and socialists who were now driven out of Russia. And they came to America, and they remained. And in fact, they became even more vehemently anarchists, socialists, communists, radicals. And they created a culture. Now, there's another book that I think that's worthy of your attention. It's called The World of Our Fathers. It was written by Irving Howe. Irving Howe, a socialist Jew, professor, very well-written book. You read the book must be 400 pages, and describes everything that went on in the immigrant generation. There is almost no mention of synagogues, Torah, or observance in the whole 400 pages. It's all about the workers' unions and the Jewish theater and the culture. But there's almost nothing about being Jewish in the book. And when he was asked why he wrote a book that, so to speak, was so blatantly absent of the other part of the Jewish story, he said he never knew the Jewish story. That's the world that he grew up in. And there was a whole culture of Yiddish. Yiddish was going to be the hallmark of American Jewry. So there were Shalom Aleichem schools and Yud Lamed Peretz schools, all of which had nothing to do with Judaism and would not survive to the modern era. But that's where all the effort was. That's where all the excitement was, and that's what everybody said that's what it's going to be. And there were other phenomena in American Jewish life. One of the great phenomena was that the Jews created the motion picture industry. Beginning in the very early 1900s, it was created by immigrant Jews. There was such a thing as the Nickelodeon in that day, very primitive, and then they developed it and they made movies. They moved out to Hollywood, and they created the motion picture. Now, the motion picture was an enormous cultural tool. It influenced everyone in the United States and may still do so. And these immigrant Jews were determined to create an ideal America. And to create an ideal America, they had to crush any Jewish observance or ideas. So it's not an accident of fate that the first sound movie in the United States, The Jazz Singer, starred Al Jolson in an autobiographical role as the son of a religious family, a cantor, and that he himself becomes a popular singer, but that he marries out of the faith, but that he nevertheless is accepted by the synagogue, and he performs kol nidre in front of everybody in the synagogue with his wife, with his non-Jewish wife present. And that was America. That's what America was going to be. It was accepted. And the Jews created this image. They created this image, and they created a utopian America. An America where it's home on the range, everything is beautiful. Later they would reverse the whole thing and create what in their mind was a disgusting America. But this had a tremendous effect. Now you have to realize every family went to the movies. The movies cost a nickel, 5 cents. So you went to the movies and you saw 2 movies, and it was hot, so the movies at least were air conditioned, so you stayed maybe for a 3rd movie. And it all had an effect. It had a great effect. And the effect was to build up in the mind of the next generation that somehow to be a success in America, to survive in America, you had to give up your Judaism. You could not combine the two. It could not happen. Now, there were attempts to swim against this. The major yeshiva in America then was Rabbi Yitzchok Elchanan Seminary in New York, REITs, which wanted to produce American-trained, English-speaking rabbis, but who would be loyal and faithful to tradition. But you had this conflict which never was resolved, that you had the older European-born rabbis. And they were a powerful, large organization called the Union of the Orthodox Rabbis of the United States and Canada, who were all European-born. Almost none of them spoke English. And when, for instance, the so-called modern Orthodox rabbi came into being, that rabbi was not accepted as being a real rabbi. They were clean-shaven. They spoke their sermons in English. The older rabbis held them to be inferior in Jewish scholarship, in Talmud. And you had this rift. And the older rabbis would eventually leave the scene. But they left over a legacy of this internal conflict within Orthodoxy itself, of the mindset that we're not going to accept certain people because they're not like us. In 1898, there was an attempt by a Sephardic rabbi in New York to create an institution that would produce American-trained rabbis who would preserve the tradition of Judaism. It was called the Jewish Theological Seminary of America. And as its head, there was a man who was world famous, Solomon Schechter, because he was the great expert on the Cairo Geniza. There was a great Geniza in Cairo that was discovered in the 1870s, and the Geniza is fascinating. It has original documents of Maimonides. It has grocery lists. It has report cards. It's a window into 10th, 11th, even earlier centuries of Jewish life in Egypt. And it also had manuscripts that we did not know existed, or that we did not have any originals to compare it to. And now it existed. And he spent like 25 years, and he restored 42,000 of these pieces of paper, parchments, etc. And he was financed by two Scottish Protestant spinsters from Cambridge University, and that's how he made his reputation. And he had a tremendous reputation to being a Jewish biblical scholar. He himself was personally observant. So when this seminary began, so first of all, the Orthodox establishment, the European rabbis, immediately discounted it because they said that's not a yeshiva. So their recollection of a yeshiva was Slobodka and Volozhin. So Schechter came. And when he came, he had a very cool reception. He was not treated in the fashion that he felt that his scholarship deserved. And in any event, the German financiers on Wall Street, who were all Reform, one of them had a son-in-law by the name of Jacob Schiff. Now, Jacob Schiff was a traditional Jew. He was not Reform. But he was convinced that Orthodoxy could not maintain itself in the United States. And he said to the seminary, I will finance you, but we have to create, and that was the birth of what today is called conservative Judaism, which somehow attempted to burn the candle at both ends. to accommodate itself completely to American life and to somehow conserve Judaism in a meaningful fashion. Originally, you could not tell the difference between the graduates of the Jewish Theological Seminary and graduates of Orthodox institutions. In fact, many of the graduates of the Jewish Theological Seminary served as leading Orthodox rabbis in the world. For instance, Chief Rabbi Hertz in England was the chief rabbi of the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth, was a graduate of the Jewish Theological Seminary. But after a period of time, as always happens, it's very hard to maintain a footing on the middle road. And conservative Judaism then broke off and it became its own. And it said that it was between Reform and Orthodox, and it was the wave of the future of the American Jewish community. Conservative Judaism was not successful in spreading its message anywhere else except the United States and Canada. In the rest of the world, it was Orthodox Judaism, and if you weren't observant, you weren't observant, but that didn't affect the definition of Judaism. You didn't create, so to speak, a new type of Judaism to fit your social needs. So that happened at the beginning. Another thing that happened, which when the Italians came, especially those from Sicily, they brought the mafia with them. That was their way of life. So you had this type of crime families that exerted tremendous financial and even political pressure, especially in the city of New York, but in other cities as well. The Jews grew up side by side with the Italians, and therefore a Jewish mafia also came into being. And the Jewish mafia for a long period of time was more powerful. And the most famous gangsters originally in the United States were Jews. I remember as a child, overhearing in my parents' home that my father complained to my mother. He said he had to conduct a funeral today. The funeral was for a Jewish mobster who was a member of the shul. And what was he going to say about him? I never knew what he was going to say about him. But that was a symptom of the times. And so you had that the immigrant Jewish community had all sorts of labels to it. It had the label of money, peddlers, which later became Wall Street, which today in the United States, when you hear the left talk about Wall Street, they're talking about Jews. They're not talking about Wall Street. The fact that many of them are Jews doesn't change that. Wall Street is a euphemism for Jews, even though most of Wall Street has never been Jewish and is not Jewish. And J.P. Morgan wasn't Jewish, and Rockefeller wasn't Jewish, and Henry Ford certainly wasn't Jewish. But that's a label. And labels eventually stick. People are not sophisticated to really know what happened. And then you have the label that Jews are not religious. Because look at Reform. And then you have the label that Jews are leftist, communists, anarchists. And then you have the label that Jews are gangsters. So when you look back at it, it's miraculous that the early Jews in the United States were not persecuted on the streets. Because everything negative in an American life was thrown and attributed to them. Now, Woodrow Wilson, who was the President of the United States during the First World War, appointed the first Jew as a member of the United States Supreme Court, Louis D. Brandeis. Brandeis met with an enormous amount of anti-Semitism on the court. There was a Southern bigot on the court, McReynolds. In all the 25 years that Brandeis was on the court, he never spoke to him once. Harvard had no Jewish professors, but then somebody bought a seat or established a chair in Semitic studies, and this wealthy man, they chose Henry Austen Wolfson, who was a graduate of Slobodka Yeshiva and who was a well-known Semitic scholar, to be the professor. There are a number of books about him, and he himself wrote a book of essays. He is the author of the famous story that one of the other professors at Harvard came up to him and said, "What makes you people think you are so special?" And Wolfson said to him, "As far as I know, we're the only people who, when we drop a book, picks it up and kisses it." But that was the atmosphere. And the second and third generation of Jews who did not want to be tarred with those labels and who wanted to get ahead. They didn't want to live in tenements on the Lower East Side. And the only way to get ahead was, they said, through education. And education meant college. It didn't mean just getting high school. Now, even high school was not then mandatory in the United States. Most Americans had a 6th or 7th grade education of elementary school, and that was it. Pretty much so today as well, even though they may attend colleges. I remember when I left the public school at 7th grade, I knew a lot. But high school was, wow, that was a level already. And college was the top of the heap. And Jews were convinced. And under Jewish pressure, for instance, the city of New York created a college, City College of New York. And it was pretty much a free college. And it was 90% Jewish. And that was the stepping stone to get out. Now, you couldn't get to medical school easily because the medical schools would not accept Jews happily. So whereas in Germany, 30 to 35% of all the doctors were Jewish before the Second World War, Roosevelt famously stated that he understood Hitler because there were too many Jewish doctors in Germany. But in the United States, there were maybe 2-3% of the doctors were Jewish. And you couldn't get in. So what did the Jews do? They formed their own medical schools. And they formed their own hospitals. So that's why in New York you had Beth Israel and Mount Sinai. In Chicago you had Mount Sinai. And these hospitals were kosher hospitals. Some of them still today are kosher hospitals. They were made by Jews for Jews. So, and would hire Jewish doctors and would have an adjunct medical school or nursing school so that Jews could go into the medical profession. All of this happened, but there still were no real Jewish religious schools of education built. Now, Yeshivas Rabbeinu Yitzchak Chanan began in the early 1900s. It produced the new Orthodox rabbi for America for decades and decades on end, even till today. But it was looked at askance again by the older traditional rabbis, even though its faculty was always older traditional rabbis. In fact, the faculty of the Jewish Theological Seminary of America, the conservative movement, was older traditional European-born rabbis who were completely observant and who were great scholars. But the school itself was something else. I certainly cannot judge people, especially people from a different generation and different circumstances. But it's an anomaly that it's hard to somehow logically explain. There was a man by the name of Bernard Revel, Dr. Bernard Revel. Revel was a Talmudic genius. He came from Eastern Europe. He came to America. He married the daughter of an Oklahoma Jew who literally struck oil and was a trillionaire. And Revel, he took Revel into the business. And Revel lasted about a year. And then he said, that's not for me. And he moved back to New York. And because of his great talents, he went to university and got a PhD. And he was one of the great Talmudic scholars. And eventually he became the head of Yeshiva Rabbeinu Yitzchak Chanan. And he built the institution till his death in the early 1940s. And he had this vision that he was going to build a yeshiva with a university as part of the yeshiva. And he realized the dream. However, again, there was great opposition to it. And till today, this divide in American Jewry, in American Orthodox Jewry, is alive and functioning on both sides of the ledger. So the immigrant generation is a generation of confusion, of terrible difficulties. But it was still part of the great magic word America, because everybody felt, here we're going to make it. The socialists felt it, the mafia felt it, the religious felt it, everybody felt it. Here we're going to make it. This is different than Europe. And it was that idea that would fuel the further development of American Jewry, topics which I hope I'll discuss with you over the next few weeks. So thank you all for coming. Have a Chag Sameach. Be well, everyone. Next Tuesday, 8:30, yes.